Hello, everyone, and we should now be live. Thank you for joining us for another SASA live stream. Today we have a masterclass, Introduction to Old Norse Religion, with Dr. Irina-Maria Manea. And I apologize if I butcher anything with pronunciation. I blame my Boston heritage. So, a little bit about what SASA is. With the Save Ancient Studies Alliance, our mission is to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. I think I flipped that, but that's okay. Where you can find us, just search at Save Ancient Studies on all of the major social media platforms, and we are there. Our live event protocol, we just ask that you please be kind and respectful, listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. We will have a moment at the end where we read them off, so feel free to plug them in the chat as we go. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. Our live streams are on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, and they will all be recorded and archived on the above platforms shortly after the events. And perhaps most importantly, have fun. And just a little bit of a plug here for our virtual conference. It is coming up Sunday, July 23rd through Monday, July 24th. I believe Irina is presenting there as well. Go to saveancientstudies.org/virtual conference to learn more. And it is free and open to the public as well. And if you enjoy our live events, our archaeo gaming, book clubs, reading groups, please consider becoming a supporter of SASA with a recurring monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us save ancient studies. Just go to saveancientstudies.org/donate to learn more. Or you can hit that little QR code in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and it will take you straight to the donation page. And thank you for joining us. I'm going to pop into the background and hand everything over to our wonderful guest.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here for the first time. A special thanks to the Save Ancient Studies Alliance for letting me organize this presentation, this short presentation on Old Norse religion. It's only the first part. Today, I'm going to be dealing with myth and belief. And a little bit on ritual and magic, although I would like to do that, to continue that in September. A little bit about myself. I currently work as a history teacher in Germany, but I am also an independent scholar of Norse mythology and the reception of Old Norse mythology. And I have been publishing on my own for the past, I think, 2 years. You can also find my PhD on academia.edu. It has to do with the reception of Old Norse mythology in contemporary Viking metal and black metal music, if anyone is interested in that. All right, so I am going to start by telling you a little bit about what we're going to do today. All right, so first of all, I am going to show you a little bit what the concept of Old Norse religion refers to, and its limitations as well, or especially its limitations. And then I'm going to delve a little bit into the sources. So I'm going to try to make a source-based approach because, as far as I've seen, especially with regard to Norse mythology, there is a load of information online, and much of it is really in the realm of speculation. So I think that's why it's vital to go back to the sources and see exactly what they tell us, and more importantly, what they don't tell us. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some poems from the Poetic Edda, which is the main source of Norse mythology, and then discuss a little bit the idea of belief in Old Norse religion. So go a little bit beyond what we can find in the Old Norse sources. Mind you, this is just, I think 1 hour, 1 hour and a half presentation. So I will definitely not be able to cover a lot, but I hope to cover sufficient as to, give you some idea about Old Norse religion and some reflection themes for later on. All right, so let's delve into it. What would be the main objectives? The main objectives would be to investigate a little bit some of the characteristics of this belief system and gain a little bit of historical insight into both pre and post Christianization in Scandinavia, because Old Norse mythology, at least because of the fact that the manuscripts we find references to Old Norse myths, they are actually written after the Christianization, and then we're going to tackle the difficulties resulting from this fact. Well, Old Norse religion, this is a term you are still going to find in scholarly research, although it has been questioned a lot, and with good reason. We basically use it to simplify things, but the term in itself is not really appropriate when investigating pre-Christian beliefs and ideas and mentalities. So to go a little bit to the etymological part, so religion would be the idea of connecting, of linking the world to a transcendent sphere, and this concept is actually very much linked to Christianization. The concept was spread throughout academia in the 19th century, but it has some limitations because the ancient peoples, since we're talking about Old Norse religion, the Vikings in our case, didn't really use this term to designate their own religion. They used either fornsider, meaning old customs, or later on you can also find the term heiðinsiðir, so heathen customs. The problem with this, let's say, systems of beliefs or a system of ideas, is first and foremost the fact that it is very hard to retrieve the performative aspect of it. So whatever has to do with cult and ritual and behavior, practice, what people actually did with the myths and whatever it is they believed in, because the texts, the written sources recording parts of Old Norse religion mostly deal with mythology. So for that, you need to resort to either archaeological sources, or you need to resort to comparisons with related practices, for example, from the Sami shamanism, to retrieve some ideas about Old Norse sorcery or magical practices, for instance. So for that matter, whenever you talk about Old Norse religion, we actually refer first and foremost to Old Norse mythology. And what does that mean? Well, that means the pantheon, so the gods and other beings, minor beings. I will come back to that a little bit later. And then we have the concept around the world. What is the world like? How does it function? So we have the cosmological aspect, the creation of the world, and then perhaps much more important than this, in the case of Norse mythology, is how the world is going to end, the eschatological aspect of it. So we do have some systematized accounts. We have the Prose Edda, which is in fact the source most people use when wanting to know more about this mythology. This has an author by the name of Snorri Sturluson, but there is also other evidence much closer to the Viking Age, for that matter, which is, for example, Scaldic poetry or eddic poetry. For that matter, we also have a couple of rune stones dealing with mythology, although I must insist that it is not really a main source of mythology, because most rune stones actually have a practical reason for being erected, not necessarily linked to religion. And like I said before, it's also very important to try to corroborate whatever we find in eddic poetry or Scaldic poetry with archaeological sources, in order to test what was written in the 13th century, because that would be the main problem, the problem of continuity and distribution. It's very hard to use 13th century sources in order to retrieve a world referring to mentality which was in fact in the 9th or 8th century, or even earlier. And the second problem would be that of distribution, because when you say Scandinavia, you're referring to a very, very vast space, and the probability of these beliefs and myths to have been circulating in the exact same form is actually very, very low. Okay. So we have this aspect of myth-based religion, and then we have the ritual-based approach. So what practical expressions people find in order to transfer the mythological discourse into practice, into cultic practice, and other types of societal definitions. For example, the importance of myths in elaborating legislation in lawmaking, for example, or in establishing the authority of kings, and so on and so forth. So whenever we talk about religion, whether Norse or anything else, it is also a question of power and ideology, and how religion translates into this more political aspect. Okay. So I already mentioned the difficult relationship between archaeological artifacts and Icelandic texts. Icelandic texts, there were writings in other parts of the northern world as well, but the main corpus on which we can retrieve this, particularly mythology, was written actually in Iceland in the Middle Ages, so beginning with the 13th century and going further on to the 14th and 15th century. It is presumed, however, that although these texts are pretty new, that there was some kind of common ground, like people used to transfer to one another generationally oral traditions. Despite some narrative variation, there would have been some kind of common ground. Now, why Icelanders in particular did that is also an interesting question. I suppose it didn't always have to do with the fact that it was dark and gloomy and they were bored and had nothing better to do than start writing stuff. It also had to do with the fact that Iceland, well, except for some Irish monks, was not really populated before the Vikings, and then the Norse plus some Celtic elements came there, and the Norse felt the need, to show the fact that they have some kind of history, some kind of ancestry, continuity, and so on and so forth. And they started after Christianization, after the development of literacy in Iceland. They started to investigate their own past, and Viking mythology / religion was also part of their past, so that's why they insisted on this as well. All right, so it has to do a little bit with this idea of collective memory. For that matter, speaking about this discontinuity in terms of geography and distribution in time, there is, I think, a better term of designating the world of beliefs in the Viking Age, which is religiolect. It's a term used by scholar Neil Price precisely to reiterate this idea that we're not dealing with a unified product. We're dealing with some kind of attempt to structure everything post-Christianization. So that's why usually we need to be careful what we actually mean when using this term, Old Norse religion. Very broadly speaking about the context, so geographically we are dealing with the North Germanic space. This space was dominated by small villages, sedentarization, forms beginning with the 1st century, at least with the first century AD development, specifically in the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark and the Skåne area in Sweden. And then we have a development of later urban centers and movements toward the north, important towns, for example, in the Viking Age with older roots than the Viking Age would be, for example, Ribe, Sigtuna, Birka, and nowadays in northern Germany, Hedeby. Very broadly speaking, we have pre-Bronze Age a battle axe or boat axe culture developing between 2800 and 2300 BC. Then we continue with the Bronze Age, and in the Bronze Age we also have some let's say religious patterns which are more or less deciphered, but which show that there was both continuity and discontinuity. I can think of one element, for example. Here you can find a lot of picture stones in the Bronze Age depicting the sun, all kinds of suns. And if you move forward to the Viking Age, you are going to find the sun in a very rare context, so it no longer occupies the important position from the Bronze Age. That's just one example. All right, then moving on, we have the pre-Roman and Roman Iron Age, and then the migration period. And from the migration period, we can also link the Scandinavian mythology with, more broadly speaking, Germanic mythology, although that's not really a term which is very used nowadays, because it presupposes this idea of unbroken, unified religious system, which was really not the case. So it's one thing when Tacitus tells us something about divination practices with the tribe of the Bructeri, for example, in the first century, and a very different thing when we read about what the Nornir did with runes carved on pieces of wood in the Voluspa, which is 900 years later at least. So we can't really make a very clear connection, but there would have been, let's say, some kind of common ground, which then developed in different directions. And then we come to the Viking Age, and because it's called Old Norse religion, it refers to the beliefs predominating in the Viking Age. So that would be roughly between 800 and 1000. So orientation 1066 is considered in historiography to be the end of the Viking Age, but then again, these dates can be fluid, and they're just used to oversimplify some very complex situations. Old Norse religion is at the intersection of the Christian world and then, like I mentioned before, the Sami world. There are a lot of hints at the fact that the Sami, in particular with reference to magic and shamanism, did influence Old Norse religion, but I will come back to this later. Linguistically speaking, we also have a development from Proto-Germanic to Proto-Norse and Old Norse being the language actually spoken by the Vikings. But mind you, we also have a collection of variants here. There was a split between East Old Norse and West Old Norse, and before that, there was an even more complicated situation. And also, mind you, that we have a development from the alphabet known as the Elder Futhark to the alphabet used in the Viking Age, which is the Younger Futhark. And speaking of this, the runic inscriptions date around the 100 or 200. We have the Vimosecom, for example, and very excitingly, a new discovery, the Idibaruk runestone. That's a discovery from this year. As a matter of fact, it is the oldest runestone, and it's written in the Elder Futhark. But I also have a slide about runes a little bit later, just as a reminder. Speaking of the Viking Age, well, you have area of population in basically southern Sweden and Norway and the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark, but then they tended to spread pretty much everywhere. So going towards Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland in Canada, and then also traveling east to the territory of Ukraine, for example, and all the way to the east to the Caspian Sea, so linked to the process of state formation in the eastern parts of Europe, and they also traveled into the direction of Spain, Normandy, and Spain as well. So you can imagine that at least some of their mentalities and beliefs were also influenced by the facts that they spread pretty much everywhere. So why I'm telling that this is because when you find an account, for example, like that of Ibn Fadlan, from Baghdad, and when he's talking about his encounters with the Varangians in the east and talking about some funeral ritual, people automatically assume that that was a thing that all Vikings did. But that's really difficult to generalize. So he's talking about a very limited space and limited time. So pay attention whenever you find such kind of sources and descriptions. They're not that many, but we also need to take into account what a geographical area we are talking about. Okay. With the slides. No, I think I'll be able to retrieve it. Okay, cool. All right, so briefly speaking, what sources do we have about Norse mythology and generally speaking about Old Norse religion? So we do have a couple of runestones talking about different things such as the apocalypse. We have the Rök runestone, which is a very enigmatic story about the end of the world, hard to decipher. We also have the Karlevi runestone or the Ramsund carving. Here we have reference to a cycle of heroic poetry referring to the hero Sigurd. But please mind you that these runestones were primarily memorial stones, so their main purpose was not a well, it was a religious one if you think that they were commemorating somebody. But other than that, yeah, don't expect to find a great deal of information regarding religion and society for that matter. Then we have, of course, the Eddas, the prose and poetic Edda, which are the main written source for this mythology. And then we also have the saga literature. Saga literature usually considered to be far-fetched in its representation of mythological content. There are reasons to believe that is true because it is late literature, and it is literature, it's not history. Many scholars consider it to be, as a matter of fact, a reception history. So what people in the 13th, 14th, 15th century thought Viking age, including beliefs, were like in the 9th and 10th century. So take it with a grain of salt. On the other hand, it would also be problematic if we completely ignore it, because we have some very interesting details. I can think, for example, of the saga of King Gautrek, where we have a reference to a sacrificial aspect. A king is being sacrificed so as to ensure the luck of his people. So these small details can help fill in some very important gaps. But yeah, take it with a grain of salt. We have the Isländiga sögur, for example. These are the family sagas, so the more realistic ones. And then we have the legendary sagas, for example, the cycle of the Volsungs, the equivalent of the Nibelungs in Germanic tradition on the continent, the Fornaldarsögur. We have the Konungasögur, the sagas of the kings, and so on and so forth. More close to the Viking Age is the Scaldic poetry. Scaldic poetry is a very complicated form of poetry written in the 9th and 10th century. Mainly, you can also find a sensational link now about Scaldic poetry online, where everything has been digitalized with explanation, commentary, and so on. I can give you a link later if you want. At any rate, some examples include Theodor of Finnr with his poem Hauslong. We have perhaps more famously the poet Egil Skallagrimsson or Egil Skallagrimsson. In modern Icelandic pronunciation, he has the poem Sonatorek with all kinds of references to Odin, for example. And then we have Håkonarmál by Eyvind the Plagiarist and Eirik Small by Bragi Boddason. These are the more known ones. We also have the poem of Ragnar, for example, Ragnarstropa. Yeah, many more, but I did not include them on the slide. So these would be the local sources. And then we have some external sources also talking about some aspects of religion. But there is here, of course, the problem of Christian interpretation, and there is also the problem of what the chroniclers writing about this stuff really understood was going on. We have the Gesta Danorum, for example, written by Saxo Grammaticus, including the perhaps famous story of Prince Amlet inspiring Shakespeare's Hamlet. And some more modern interpretations. And then we have Adam of Bremen with his Gesta Hamburgensis, where we have the reference to the temple, or what he believes to be a temple in Uppsala. Some legal texts, such as the Icelandic Grey Goose Law Code, the Krogos, can also be useful here, or various lists with kings. So these would be some of the written sources available to us. Other than that, we do have picture stones, particularly from the island of Gotland in Sweden. These have no runic inscriptions on them, so they are just pictures of either religious processions or some figures about whom we may or may not know who they are and what they're doing. Also some interesting symbols such as the Valknut, although it was later called like that. And yeah, you can see a lot of question marks here because there isn't really a certainty at any rate that these figures or scenes we so far identified actually matched what they were really in the age. So we have, for example, the Töngjörda picture stone, the Sturahamash picture stone, and also an interesting stone this time from Cumbria, so not from Scandinavia, probably depicting Loki. And speaking of sources from outside of Scandinavia, the Gosforth cross is also an interesting example. Here you can find a lot of mythological references which corroborate some stuff Snorri in his Prose Edda is talking about. For example, you can find the wolf Fenrir, the one who is going to kill Odin at the end of time, and he is being slain by Vidar, who is one of Odin's sons, born particularly for that purpose. All right. Besides these picture stones, you can also find small objects such as the famous Mjolnirs, the hammers of Thor, for example, in Ödeshög in Skåne, in Bredsätra, and so on. There is also a interesting figurine found near Akureyri in Iceland, probably depicting Thor because, he looks as if he were holding a hammer. Also, some other figures. So, for example, the figure with Odin, probably Odin from later because he's depicted on a throne. A figurine with a giant phallus, probably representing the fertility god Freyr, probably from Rellinge. And not only the gods are represented on these figurines, but also some minor deities, for example, Valkyriur, as the case in the discoveries in Tiso and in Horby. All right. Besides this, we also have some pre-Viking material that can be somewhat useful, although the function is unclear. We have a lot of figurines either engaging in social activities such as marriage, or being depicted with some kind of tools or other stuff we don't really know what they are. The tiny gold foils retrieved from sites such as Upakro, Sortmul, or Larvik. Their function, I repeat, is unclear, and it is also unclear whether they actually depicted deities or maybe they just depicted some persons from the elite, something like that. Other sources include the Oseberg tapestry. This was retrieved from the burial from the 9th century in Norway, and you can find here a beautiful procession, what seems to be procession with chariots and figurines with horns reminiscent of other artifacts from previous ages, such as the Torslunda plates, probably with reference to some kind of ritual linked to shape shifting as well and other magic practices. And last but not least, place names. Place names can also be very suggestive. In fact, there are some references in place names to deities about whom we know very little from Eddic mythology, such as the god Ullr. We have a lot of names such as Ulevi, and in Sweden in particular, and this shows that he might have been much more important than what we have left from Snorri or whatever Eddic poem, and so on. Another case would be the god Tyr. The god Tyr is featured in a very important myth. He sacrifices his hand to the wolf Fenrir so as to ensure, let's say, cosmic order. But other than that, he doesn't really appear in other myths. However, the toponyms from Denmark, the large amount of toponyms from Denmark would suggest he was much more important than thought. His name as well is cognate with Zeus and Deus, so we might think maybe he was more important than Odin at some point because of these cognates, but there isn't really any way of telling it for sure. And speaking of these artifacts and of the issue about continuity and when these people actually started worshipping the gods who are mentioned in poetry, we have a very important discovery from the Vindalev treasure hoard from Denmark. We have an inscription in the Elder Futhark, so it's not the Viking language, it's a little bit before that, with an elite figure, probably a warrior, chieftain, king, or something like that. And the inscription, he is Odin's man. So this connection between Odin as a representative of the elite and the higher social order of Scandinavia, pre-Viking Scandinavia, is made clear on this artifact. And this artifact is from the 5th century, as a matter of fact. And this is the most exciting thing. So from migration times, this constitutes, such artifacts constitute a bit of evidence that maybe not everything we have from the Middle Ages is some fantasy of a Christian author, which is why it is very important to take into account all kinds of archaeological artifacts when trying to restore some of these beliefs in God or in gods or other beings. Okay, so here you can see a couple of examples of the Mjolnir I mentioned before in different shapes and sizes. So Bredsetra, Moheda, Skåne, Römerstall, and Raus. These hammers are usually in connection with the fact that Christianity started to spread, and they were molded as a reaction to the spread of Christianity. You can also find a lot of molds with the possibility to make both hammers and crosses. So people were kind of fluid with regard to their religious affiliation. So at least a couple of 100 years, I would say that Christianity was the official religion, but in terms of what people actually worshipped and believed in, things were a little more flexible. And this very childish-like drawing is actually part of a runestone, is the Altuna stone, and presumably it is also a representation of Thor, or at least of his hammer. Okay, and the runestone I mentioned before, the Rök runestone, this is one long runestone, probably the longest or among the longest ones, where you have this enigmatic version of the end of the world depicted on it. And then other objects you can see here are the Odin from Leire. So this figure I told you about sitting on the throne, presumably the Hilskjalf. It's mentioned in the Poetic Edda that Odin has a throne, and from that throne he can see and monitor everything that's happening in the world. But then again, his attire seems to be a little feminine, and then poses a different kind of problem. For example, in research, there is this trend about talking on gender talk, and without transferring some modern concepts to civilizations which did not have them, we can still ask ourselves the question about some deities probably being represented as androgynous in nature, and in particular with reference to gods and mythical creatures. Maybe the boundary between the classical male-female differentiation would have been a little blurred. So if you think about Loki, for example, who also has children, as a matter of fact, you can see that maybe the concept of gender was a little bit more fluid in the Viking age as well, or in particular with reference to mythology. You can also see Thor here from near Akureyri in Iceland. So he has a hammer. Again, it's very difficult to say if it's really Thor or maybe another character. We don't really know, but we can assume he is, maybe. And this figurine could have also been a figurine used in the Knefatafel, so in the chess-like game Vikings used to play. Another interesting figure is the Valkyria from Horby. That's also quite a new discovery. I think it was from 10 years ago or something like that. Again, question mark everywhere for the reason stated before. The last picture I wanted to show you is the picture from the Stora Hammars stone from Gotland, where you can see this object, which presumably has to do something with the slain, the knot of the slain. Although again, there isn't really much evidence on what the symbol was, or what the gods used to do with it, but the scene does seem to represent something resembling a sacrifice. We have some elements there reminiscent of Odin, such as birds and the spear. Okay. A little bit about the runes and whether the runes are useful in retrieving some aspects of Old Norse religion or not. I must say from the start that I do think that there is a lot of fuzz going on about runes in general. I've seen dozens, maybe hundreds of sites using runes as the main source for Old Norse religion, with, of course, all kinds of definitions and patterns and indications about how to use rune magic. That's, well, far-fetched, to say the least, because runes were not really inherently magical. They're rather an alphabet, or they were used to make out several alphabets, the oldest one being the Elder Futhark from about 160 AD, and then we have the alphabet of Old Norse since the 800s. But with regard to their magical use or their mythical use, it's rather a matter of content than the string of words. because you can find inscriptions with incantations, curses, and more often healing magic. So if you look at Swedish amulets from 1000, for example, you can find something like Bovis prayer to God, to Thor, sorry, in order to cure him for some foulness on his skin. And Thor does appear to be a more popular god among common folk, like regular people, than Odin. Um, all right, so if you find lists with runes, with stuff like this rune represents wealth, and this rune is used to invoke love, and that rune is used to invoke whatever, it's not really based on a lot here. Um, However, we do have some hints that maybe runes were also used in themselves in order to invoke something, but that's again with a very big question mark. We have, for example, the so-called Alu inscriptions. The Alu inscriptions, well, it doesn't really mean something, this inscription, so that's why generally scholars tend to believe it is ritual, magical in nature. It may, however, etymologically have to do with an old root meaning amulet. So people just writing on bracteates. Bracteates were like these uh, coin shape small medallions used during the migration times, and maybe people were just using them to say what the object was. It wouldn't have been that uncommon. Runes do tend to have a meaning, a particular meaning, again, for the upper class. We also have a reference in a poem called Sigurdrivumol. It is a poem from the cycle of the Volsungs. It is this cycle with the hero Sigurd, and the hero Sigurd saves the Valkyria Brunhild, was being punished by Odin by not being able to get out of her armor, being punished because she didn't choose a warrior he wanted her to choose, or something like that. And then Sigurd rescues her, and she's like, okay, I'm gonna show you how to use these runes, because they are runes of power, and you're going to be able to do great things with them. Perhaps the most relevant, or at least compelling source for the meaning of runes, in the sense of sacred knowledge possessed by somebody in the upper class, like a king, would be in the sayings of the High One being the second poem of the Poetic Edda. I will talk a little bit about that a little later. We have an initiatory stance here where Odin describes how he acquired knowledge. We have here this idea that being able to write, so having knowledge about the writing system in general, would be a domain of authority and kingship. You know, it's not. It is about mystical wisdom, but in itself, the performative act of writing is in itself mystical. So you don't need to go further on. So for time reasons, I'm just gonna tell you the translation of that without reading it in Old Norse. So the poem in stanzas 137 and 140 describes how Odin gained knowledge, and he talks about a self-sacrifice. So he says in stanza 137, for example, that he knows he hung on a wind-swept tree, and he did that 9 long nights. He was pierced by a spear and was given to himself, so given to Odin, on that tree whose roots grow in a place no one has ever seen. Probably a reference to Yggdrasil, the world tree. And then he goes on to describe the price of the sacrifice, that no one gave him food and no one gave him drink. And in the end, he looked down and he took the runes, took them screaming, so in this magical act. And then he fell, and afterwards he learned 9 spells from the son of Bolthorn and the father of Bestla. These are creatures, part of the cosmogonical myth. And then he also goes on to say that he won a drink from the mead, the famous mead of poetry. So again, we have this reference of to gaining sacred knowledge. Very important in the overall image this god has in Norse mythology. Okay, a little bit about Scaldic poetry and its importance in retrieving some aspects of Old Norse religion. Scaldic poetry is important particularly because of the fact that it is closer to the Viking Age than many other sources. It is a very complicated art form from the 700s. It's based on older forms of Germanic poetry, very alliterative in its structure, and therefore very difficult to construct. It's recognizable by its very convoluted patterns, and it is mostly recorded in Icelandic manuscripts. Why is it relevant to Old Norse mythology in particular? Because of the metaphors. They're very complicated metaphors used by poets, the so-called kenningar. For example, we have here the Karlevi stone. I think I mentioned it before. It is a stone in memory of somebody called Sibi, and it is it has a stanza preserved in a form of rhyme known as the Drottkvætt, so the kingly verses or something like that. Anyway, something related to kingship and authority at any rate. So in this verse, and this is very unusual because it's actually written on a runestone, and Scaldic poetry, yeah, like I said, doesn't really appear on runestones. And we have here, for example, a metaphor Thrud's battle tree. It's a metaphor, a kenning for chieftain. And we also have something a little more complicated than that. We have a name of Odin, for example, Vidur, Vidur of the carriage of the sea kings. Endil, which was a giant, something about a mighty dominion rule. It's something very convoluted, but also referring to the chieftain. So apparently this had some kind of political and religious significance because kings employed poets. It was a very important job at the time to be employed at the court of a king and to write about the king. To compose eulogies. It was a tool in legitimizing power, and it remained popular until about the 13th century, when it started being replaced by chivalric romances, for example, or at any rate poetry inspired by the continent. Which brings us to our friend Snorri, who wrote extensively on Norse mythology. And he might have done so, might have decided to write about Norse mythology after paying a visit to Norway in 1218 and coming to the conclusion that people have started to forget the ancient art of poetry. So he decided, as a consequence, to write the Prose Edda, which is basically conceived as a manual on poetry and how to use poetry as a reaction to these new literary developments. This Snorri guy is probably also the author of Heimskringla, the orb of the world, the history of the kings of Norway, and he also had the political interest, by the way, in writing all this stuff because he was involved in some very brutal and problematic struggles in Iceland in the 13th century for domination on the island. And the consequence of this problematic period was the fact that Iceland lost its independence, but that's another story. All right, so he basically wants to explain the metaphors using Norse mythology because he came to the conclusion that people no longer understand them. Which brings us to the most important part of his work. The first part of his work is called the Gylfaginning, the deception of King Gylfi. It was probably added later as a frame. The longer part of this work is the Skålskaparmál, the art of poetry, the art of creating a Scaldic material where he teaches poets on how to do that. And then he also has a piece, Hotatal, where he explains the different types of rhymes. This work was very important. It is found in several manuscripts, for example, in the Codices Upsaliensis, Regius Vormianus, and Trajectinus. And if you read the work, you are going to come to the conclusion that he must have had access to a lot of oral knowledge, or maybe some other manuscripts which are lost to us, because he has a lot of quotations which are not really retrievable from other sources, which is why, despite the fact that he had a particular religious affiliation and political interest, the source is still interesting for us who deal with Old Norse mythology and religion. His Christian approach is very visible in the prologue, because in the prologue he basically designates the Norse gods as being humans migrating from Asia, migrating from Troy. He euhemerizes them, so turns them into humans. It's actually a concept he gives up later on. It's a concept he also uses somewhere else in the Ynglinga saga, for example, which is a legendary saga about the kings of Sweden who have a lineage going back to the god Freyr. What does he want to do with all this stuff? Well, he basically wants to offer us a very structured version of Norse myth, a very compact one, and understandable one. Yeah, so he's very influenced, like I said, about this Christian view of the world, and later on we have this this whole obsession with taxonomy that keeps developing. So the need to have everything very organized, the need to have, for example, certain functions linked to certain gods. And what Snorri is attempting to do, and what we are attempting to do, actually would have probably been very strange for Vikings and the people before the late Iron Age Scandinavians, in that structured versions of myths would probably not have existed at all. Moving on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the other source, which is the more important source because it is poetry. And because it is poetry and it is written in this very complicated, convoluted form, it would have meant that people actually needed to remember what was being said. And because of that, this oral tradition, despite being written down in the 13th century, actually has some pretty high chances of being very old and very close to the Viking Age. This is also provable by the fact that we have some errors in the manuscripts, in alliterative forms, for example, some letter and sound that do not fit, and it was probably another sound like 300 years ago, and this is how you can actually tell that the poems are older than the 13th century. So the Poetic Edda is to be found particularly in one manuscript, which is the Codex Regius, so the book of the kingly book, Konungsbok, and this book was delivered in the 17th century to the Bishop of Skalholt. It was initially attributed to a historian by the name of Simondur, but after that it wasn't attributed to him anymore. It's actually a collection of anonymous poems. You can find it in other manuscripts as well, or at least some of the poems you can find in other manuscripts. And there are also poems which are not found in the Codex Regius, but found in other manuscripts. And I mentioned here the Codex Vormianus or Ormsbok, the Flateyjarbók, and the Hauksbok. Sometimes there are essential differences, and I'm going to give you an example a little later. What do these poems contain? Well, mostly mythology, and generally speaking, some wisdom about how to live your life in accordance to the old customs or old traditions. Why this book exists? Well, that's also an interesting question. I presume it was about an antiquarian interest here at stake. So also something related to cultural memory, because these poems were, you know, written down very late, and on the other hand, like I said, some of them, if you look at the language, are definitely archaic. For example, I think the oldest one, or at least some of the oldest, among the oldest ones, we have the poem Atlakvida. This is actually not a poem about the gods. It is a poem about in the cycle of the heroes. It is with reference to Atli, which is a Norse name for King Attila. So it has to do with this Germanic cycle, continental Germanic cycle um, of the Nibelungs, Volsungs, with the hero Sigurd in its center. At any rate, without going further into details, we have the linguistic features suggesting the archaic nature of at least some of the poems, and then we also have in particular one poem, the Rikstula, talking about social conventions which were not specific to Iceland but were specific to Scandinavia, so in particular to Norway. And this is also a hint to the fact that there was some kind of oral transmission, and at some point some Christian authors decided that they were either important for cultural memory or the sheer curiosity, and they started writing them down. These poems are written in Old Norse, but they are written in the Latin alphabet, so not in runes, and they are mainly poems about gods and also about heroes, and the poems about the heroes are mainly about the cycle of the Volsungs, and also some poems about the hero named Helgi. Okay, so you are going to find a lot of complex meters in eddic poetry as well as in Scaldic poetry. So you're going to find, for example, Fornidisslag, which is used to talk about very old stories, or when you have dialogues with Odin, you are going to find the Ljóðaháttr and the Mólaháttr in conversation. So mostly these alliterative forms depend on the context, so they're really part of the way mythology and religion are expressed in these poems. Noteworthy is also the fact that we have a lot of prose, prologues, interjections, and epilogues, and even marginal notations in many of these poems, which lead us to believe that there was some kind of performative value to them. So probably at least some of them were also used not only in the sense of being recited at some kind of festival or at the court of a king or a chieftain, but maybe some of them were even played, as in a play, a theater play. For example, the quarrel between Loki and the other gods. There is a poem about that. These hints again reinforce this idea that mythology, these stories had a function in court, and they were related to the exercise of power, and this might be a reason why they survived at all. Among the most important poems, I offered here a couple of examples, and I'm going to briefly discuss some of them. We have the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, the sayings of Odin, also called the High One, so the Hovamol, the lay of Vafthrudnir, Vafthrudnismol, the lay of Grimnir, which is another name for Odin, Grimnismol, Loki's quarrel or wrangling, Lokkasena, the lay of Alvis, Alvismol, the lay of Skirnir, Skirnismol or for Skirnis, the lay of Völund or Völundarkvida, the lay of Thrym or Thrymskvida, the lay of Rig, Rigstula, the lay of Helgi Hjörvarsson, Helgakvida Hjörvarssonar, the lay of Sigurdrifa, Sigurdrifumol, Helgakvida Hundingsbana 1 and 2, the other poems about the hero Helgi. And many other poems with reference, like I said, to the cycle of the Volsungs, such as Fofnismol, the Lay of Fofnir. I repeat, these are only some of them which fit the slide. Okay, and a little bit about some of them. Perhaps the most important one would be the Voluspa. This is the prophecy of the Volva, the prophecy of the Cirrus. It is the poem that starts the Poetic Edda, and it is contained in the Codex Regius in the Hauksbok, and it is also quoted quite extensively by the author Snorri. It is basically a conversation between Odin and a dead Cirrus, and it's a poem with a lot of allusions, and we need to have here some kind of we need to speculate a little bit here about what these allusions actually mean, because it's a very difficult poem to understand, and it's not the only one sharing this problem. Very important here is the figure of the Cirrus of the Volva. It is a vital mythological figure, and not only in Norse mythology, you can also find this figure earlier on. For example, Tacitus mentions such a figure when talking about the Bructeri tribe. The witch Veleda, and it comes up also later on in the sagas of the Icelanders. For example, we have Osiris Thorbjorg performing a ritual because the people were suffering from a bad harvest. But then again, you can see that there is a difference between Tacitus writing in 100 AD and whatever memories Icelanders had in the 30th century about such a figure. So again, the problem of continuity. But anyway, what we have here as a common element is this divinatory trance. So you have a woman, an elderly woman, going into a trance and then finding answers to vital questions. And this aspect is linked to circumpolar concepts of magic. So speaking of the link between Viking and Sami traditions. It is an important source for both cosmogony and eschatology, this poem, because we find references to how the world was made, Ginnungagap, for example, and then the creation of the primordial giant Ymir, and then you also have references to eschatology. So there is a lengthy description of the signs preceding the Ragnarok, and of what happens during Ragnarok itself, and how the world is going to be revived. And speaking of the world being revived, there is a long debate going on about the potential Christian influence. And whereas in the Codex Regius this may or may not be confirmed, we do have another version in the Hauksbok manuscript actually mentioning the fact that someone important is going to arrive at the end of the world and restore it. And this is more than certain a reference to the figure of Jesus Christ. Okay, what is characteristic for this poem? It has a lot of vivid pictures and impressive ones. Also, this whole image about the world falling apart is dominated by the idea of fate, the idea that your trajectory in life, including the gods, cannot be changed, and it is only a matter of revealing itself to you, and you just have to accept it, and with that also accept the end of all things. There is also the theory that this might have been the work of a heathen poet, potentially in contact to already converted Christian, in this case Celtic population. Thus, we have some kind of dialogue between the Christian and the Norse tradition, although the fact that you have these elements talking about revival is not necessarily a clear evidence that it was a Christian influence. The poem seems to be very old because you find some reference to it in Scaldic poetry as well, and this has a clearer date. So, for example, you have the Skald Arnor using similar imagery in the 11th century. Without further ado, let's look a little bit at the structure of the poem. So you have a beginning with the recitation. So Odin basically begs this woman, the Volva, to talk to him about the world. So again, we have this image of Odin trying to figure out stuff, trying to know more about the world. This thirst for knowledge, which is characteristic for this particular god. Then you have reference to the creation of the world. Very interesting is the list of dwarves after the creation of the world. Why it is here is very difficult to say. Then we also have a reference to the creation of men by a triad of gods. And then you also have the image of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and of course the very compelling image of the Nornir, the so Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, the three Norns, not depicted here with this classical imagery of working on a loom in order to weave fate. This is found in another source actually, and the evidence for it is quite flimsy. They're just depicting writing fates on carving the fates on pieces of wood in runes, as a matter of fact. Okay, very important in this cosmogonical order is the first war between the Asir and the Vanir. This is usually interpreted as um, the domination of one older group of gods, potentially associated with the fields and fertility. These would be the Vanir, and they are afterwards dominated by the Aesir, by this part of the pantheon rather linked to ideas of kingship and elitehood. The problems start with the death of Balder. So beginning with stanza 32, and this happens as a result of the machinations of the god Loki, who tricks the blind deity Hodr in killing his own brother Balder. And then we have a representation of the underworld, which serves as a prelude to Ragnarok. And Ragnarok is depicted with these very gigantic, compelling images with, for example, brothers starting fighting each other, and then you also have some roosters announcing the end, and then things start moving with Loki coming up in front of a ship made out of nails. So all kinds of yes, this imagery which suggests total destruction. And then you have again these struggles between the gods and all kinds of figures associated with chaos and destruction. For example, the god Odin himself is going to be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir at the end. The poem, however, ends on a, let's say, happy note, because there are some gods who are actually coming back. The sons of Thor, for example, as well as some of the children of Odin as well, and they get to erect another hall by the name of Gimle. And on the other hand, the element of destruction and chaos is not completely gone, because you have, for example, the dragon Nidhogg still gnawing on the world tree. So whether this is a cycle or a series of cycles is quite difficult to say, because we often find this idea, especially in online sources, that there is a series of cycles. I'm not very sure about that. I mean, I don't think there is enough evidence to confirm that, but yeah, there is not enough evidence to infirm it either. Okay. The next poem in the series is the Hovamol, which is very different in its approach. The Sayings of the High One, also presumably one of the older poems in the Codex Regius, probably a compilation of several minor poems, and it is the longest one. It comprises no less than 164 stanzas. Um, then again, it might also have been one single composition. Very difficult to say. Um, it has gnomic content, which means it is very similar. Let's say, for example, in comparison to the biblical proverbs, you have very practical advice about how to lead a moderate and fulfilling life. And you can also divide this poem into several parts. You have the unnamed speaker, but it is clear that it is Odin who doles out knowledge about worldly matters, also sexual intrigues and myths, rituals, runes, and magic. I also quoted something from it before, speaking of magic. And you have, for example, Gestathottet. Yeah, that's the part where he's giving all this advice about how to be pleasant, how to act in your relationships to other people, and so on and so forth. And then you have his advice about love, because he also had some love affairs with important characters. One of them being the giantess who actually gained um, um, one actually being the giantess who let him or who allowed him to be able to drink from the mead of poetry. So pretty important. Lord Fafnismol is also a part with Odin, talking about all kinds of initiation situations. And Odin is able to to bestow upon us so much wisdom, because he is associated with so many things. It is impossible to assign a single function to him. So he's associated with warriorhood, with kingship, with magic, with death, and so on and so forth. And his role is one that relates to somebody's ability to navigate these matters. So he basically establishes rules, and if you live by these rules, you are able to do well in life as a young warrior, for example. um, Ljóðatal, for example, is another important part of the poem. It has a list of magical spells that Odin knows, following the episode with him gaining knowledge following his access to the runes. Um, all right, so what we can conclude from this part of the poem is, from this part of the Poetic Edda, is this common ground with ancient Germanic poetry in general, in the sense of these both mythical references and this part of more worldly wisdom, and the part where you have a god offering a life practical advice to the audience. In Vaftrudnismol, the poem following this, um, you also have this idea of encyclopedic poetry. It's also a relatively old poem because of that, or can be considered as such. It's not really certain, cannot be dated with certainty, but then again, what can? And it begins with a prelude, and then Odin goes and has a test with the giant Vafthrudnir, who is a very wise character. And he begins questioning him on different matters related to cosmology, basically, and it progresses towards the theme of Ragnarok. The game is eventually won by Odin, because he asks a question only he can know the answer to, what he spoke into the ear of his son Balder at the burning of his pyre. What would be the message of this poetry with regard to this cosmological order? Well, it would be this idea of contrast between gods and Jotnar and giants, because Vafthrûdnir is a representative of the other mythical family, the family of the Jotnar, of the giants, and Odin, by defeating him in what can be deemed a very popular game of riddles that was very popular within Viking society. Um, is that this order established by the Aesir, by the gods represented by Odin, is actually enforced one way or another. And together with the poem Grimnismol, it can be considered somewhat of a dictionary of Norse mythology, because it talks a lot about both the social framework and it has all kinds of references enforcing this framework. And I think I should have started with Grimnismol, actually, not with Vafthrûdnismol. Would have made more sense, I guess, but it's not that important. Two poems are very similar. As a matter, also Grimnir, sorry, is also one of the names of Odin. It means the cloaked one or the masked one, and the content of the poem is also initiatory. So again, you always have this idea that there is a god enforcing some kind of order, and Odin here actually accepts a challenge put forward by his wife Frigg, because both of them saved two children by the name of Agnar and Geirrod, and Geirrod is instructed on how to become a king, and he turns out to not respect all the rules, in that he kills his brother, but then he has a child of his own, which he names Agnar, and his son is actually the one Odin manages to have a good relationship to, because Odin embarks on this quest of testing Geirrod and what he has been doing, and he ends up being tortured by him. But then again, his son gives him mead and sets him into a trance, and as a result of this trance, Odin is able to offer a lot of cosmic knowledge. He describes the center of the world, for example. The poem alludes to the creation and to the Ragnarok as well, to the underworld, the outer world, and so on and so forth. And finally, Odin reveals himself at the end of the poem, with a long list of names. And eventually, Geirrod dies in the end, and Agnar replaces Geirrod. So this also has this political element to it, because it is a test of hospitality as part of this kingship ideology. And Geirrod fails this test, so he has to be replaced with somebody else. So besides all these revelations and this encyclopedic character, it's also very dramatic in the sense that it reestablishes some moral grounds and codes, and these moral grounds and codes are patronized by this elite deity known as Odin. What I can also offer an example of, so besides this poem with either gnomic character or moral character, we have different types of poems here. So not everything is like this. So we have, for example, Lokasena, which is probably among my favorite poems. As a matter of fact, it is Loki's truth-telling or flighting, as is the older term. So this is basically a poem where Loki mocks the other gods. It was a game of insults, which was again very popular among the Norse. We also have a prose introduction to it. It deals with Loki's invitation to a feast of the gods, and this happens in the context of Ragnarok, supposedly, or at least according to the prose framework, and with the very important detail that Loki has a blood brotherhood with Odin and cannot be cast away. There is a long exchange of insults here with all kinds of deities. For example, with Bragi, the patron of poetry, Idun, Geviun, lesser known deities, Odin himself, Frigg, the goddess Freya, patronizing love. And then you also have Njordtir, the servant, included, and then Heimdall, Skadisiv, so all kinds of deities. And what is interesting is that mostly these insults deal with unmanliness, or being accused of being unmanly, or in the case of women, they are accused of being too sexual, too promiscuous. So there is in permanence this idea of somehow perverted sexuality, or something that does not belong to the social order which is accepted. And a basic rule of this game is that the contestants must find a subject to taunt their opponent with, and this is going to trigger an emotional response and will disqualify the opponent. This, because of the topic itself, we can also ask ourselves the question of whether the poem was written as some kind of taunting, in the sense of a Christian taunting the gods as being representatives of heathen beliefs. We can ask ourselves this question as well. Okay. And I have two more poems, and then I'm going to move on with the last section of this presentation, which, obviously lasted longer than I would have expected. I just wanted to show you a little bit of interesting information about something which is falsely presumed. I mean here the fact that people assume that these poems only deal with gods. That's not the case. Sometimes they deal with deities or minor deities, which are not really gods. So we have, for example, the Völundarkvida, which is a poem about an elf, but not an elf in the modern sense, or in the sense of medieval folklore or Tolkien sense. It is actually a pretty brutal poem. It deals with a hero, very common in other contexts as well. The hero Völund, you can also find him in the literary tradition from Anglo-Saxon England, with the name Wayland the Smith. There is a poem, an Anglo-Saxon poem called Deor's Lament, mentioning him, and we also have some imagery from the impressive 8th century Franks casket, which has a lot of imagery, both Christian and pagan. So you can say that this figure is generally Germanic. You also have the Latin poem Valtarius mentioning him, and he comes up also a little later in saga literature, in Thithrek saga, for example. This is a late saga. And these different versions are actually evidence of what I've been telling you so far, the fact that there is really no fixed or traditional authority with regard to these stories. Most likely there were different versions of the same story circulating throughout the whole geographical area where people were speakers of Germanic before Old Norse. And then these versions developed and brought about versions of their own, if you want. So there isn't really a traditional authority here. Anyway, I recommend you read this poem because you are going to like it, because it's very different than anything else. And we have two parts of it. The first part is about some Valkyrias, or swan maidens, as they are called in the poem, with this elf Volund and his brothers marrying them and then being left by them. And then the second part includes Volund's revenge. This is actually the brutal part, because this smith is captured and tortured by a king called Nidud. He is lamed and cannot go away. He is forced to work the whole time and craft gold, and he has his revenge by killing Nidud's sons, and then adorns their skulls with silver, afterwards raping and impregnating his daughter Bodvild. And for this name we also have a reference in Anglo-Saxon literature, also evidence of the fact that these stories kind of circulated all over the place during the migration period. And then this elf eventually flies away with self-crafted wings. So he is actually named the king of the elves. Is there an association with dwarves? By the way, we don't really know. Speaking of elves and dwarves, the difference and border between them was not that clear in Norse mythology. And we can also ask ourselves the question of whether the trickster god Loki might have been linked to this character as well, some kind of inspiration, or the other way around. In other versions of the story, he also appears to have crafted important objects such as Beowulf's shirt, or the sword of the famous hero Sigurd. And the last character would be from the poem Alvismol. This is a poem, speaking of dwarfs, this is a poem about a dwarf. It is again the typical test of knowledge, but this time for a dwarf wanting to marry Thor's daughter. It doesn't really contain mythological elements, or at least in its direct form, but it does contain a lot of intricate Scaldic formulas, the Kenningar I mentioned before. And there are some scholars who, because of that, assume that it is part of the late poetic revival, maybe. Dwarves are not really featured in a lot of myths, but when they are featured, they have an important role, because they're usually creators of tools. And we have, for example, the myth of Brock and Sindri being taunted by Loki to lose a game, in the context of the myth about Loki stealing Steve's hair and then being forced by Thor to create some to replace it. And in this context, he also manages to persuade the dwarves to create a lot of essential mythological objects for the gods. And a couple of dwarves are also involved in the story of the meat of poetry, because they kill the mythical creature known as Kvasir, who was made out of the holy spit of the two groups of gods, the Vanir and the Asir. So again, you have all kinds of such references, and it adds up to this the richness of this mythology, not limited to the gods. But anyway, in this particular poem, Alvis Allwise eventually turns into stone, which leads us to another problem, which would be the issue about the inspiration in medieval folklore. Because in medieval folklore, for example, trolls are the ones who get turned into stone eventually. So you can see here some connections with older material as well. There is at any rate an interaction between all these traditions. The last poem, I hope it's the last poem. Yes, it is the last poem. Okay, good. I wanted to talk a little bit about Rikstula as well. This is the poem of Rik, which is actually a Celtic term. It is with reference to Heimdall, at any rate, but I wanted to show you that we do have in this type of poetic, mythological content, we also have some references to cultural and sociological realities, because this is a poem and it's actually an exception in all this landscape. By the way, it's not part of the classical Codex Regius, it's part of the Codex Formianus, so it's not one of the main manuscripts, but either way, it explains the organization of society, but not of the society of the gods, of the society of men. So it explains the castes of society, the king, warriors, peasants, and thralls, so the slaves. Um, um, we have the hero, the god Heimdall, who is this Rig guy, according to the annotator of the poem. This would be a little uncertain, so I mean this identification with Heimdall, but we also have a reference in the poem Voluspa, the prophecy of the seers, with men being described as the children of Heimdall. So he might have also played a role. He might actually have played a role in this aspect of creating the social stratification of people. And throughout the poem, we have the god Heimdall, like I said, so creating these three different strata of society by sleeping between I and Edda. It would be great grandfather and great grandmother. Speaking of Edda, this would be a proposal of why the poem is called like this. Then he sleeps between grandmother and grandfather, Avi and Amma, and then between father and Modir, father and mother, and he creates, he helps produce these different strata of society. The Celtic influence would be something to remember here. He might have been a potential poet visiting the Celtic islands and then working at maybe the Danish court. There is some kind of evidence for that, of contacts with maybe the Orkneys or Ireland and so on and so forth. Rig itself being a Celtic name, but then in the last stanza, and I think this is a piece of evidence in this direction, you have a mention of the halls of Dan and Damp. This is a reference in the Skjoldunga saga to Rigus and Dana, who are part of the Danish myth of statehood or something like that. So he might have had something to do with the Danish court, but under a little bit of Celtic influence. So you can see here there is a lot of interculturalism and interconnections going on. So if we read these poems, such poems, as well as other ones, what do we gain from them? Because this is really the question. I tried to present to you, more or less briefly, a couple of ideas from some of these poems. Like I said, it's impossible to talk about powder stuff in such a limited time. I would need I don't know, a whole course for it. Maybe I'm going to make it someday. But at any rate, this important source on Norse mythology gives us a glimpse of the mental universe of the people who probably produced it as well. So first of all, we have general ideas about the world of the gods and how it functioned. And then besides that, we also have a little bit of reference to the moral order, the pre-Christian moral order, with values such as valor and heroism, oath taking, revenge, hospitality, and so on and so forth. Mainly seen in the sayings of the High One, but also referenced to in other poems as well. So we also have the social dimension. It's not completely missing in these stories, although they are in essence mythological stories. We also have the very prevalent idea in the Viking Age of destiny and fatalism, which is in Old Norse, by the way. It's not weird, as I often see. Weird is a term used in Anglo-Saxon. The term in Old Norse would actually be Urlog to designate fate, but Weird is associated with one of the goddesses of destiny, which is Urd. Yeah, one of them. It's Urdverdandian school. So we have this this general idea of fate being something given to you, and you're the one who needs to manifest it. And by this, you show that you possess the other values from the moral code, like valor, heroism, so on and so forth. We also gain a little bit of a perspective on the potential afterlife, and we have this idea of a universe, a mental universe, being completely intertwined with magic. So if you corroborate the poems with other references from archaeology, from saga literature, you are going to see that believing in the gods was not actually a question in the Viking ages, at least. So it was assumed to be so. However, this is also, I think, important to highlight, and perhaps more important than the meaning of the poems is to highlight the limitations. So we clarified so far the Poetic Edda is probably the most. It is actually not probably. It is without doubt the most important source on Norse mythology, the most important written source, but you have preservation in two main manuscripts with later copies and verses as well. And you have a lot of variation. So this means that you don't really know who and to what purpose created this whole stuff. I presume it was the work of a collector, just interested in what was going on in pre-Christian times, and again with reference to this theme of collective memory, and maybe establishing a link with your ancestors as part of the cultural identity, particular in Iceland. But in many of these manuscripts, you have incomplete stuff, or you have fragmentary stuff, broken lines, and so on and so forth, and a lot of unclear stuff with gaps. A lot of gaps of knowledge. Then you have the problem of the content. The content is, generally speaking, very ambiguous in nature and very elusive, and it doesn't have that structured form Snorri tries to give us. So it's knowledge for the initiated. It's also very difficult to date, and there are a lot of things which are left unexplained, because this poetry, presumably when it was actually circulating in its oral form, the poets didn't really feel the need to explain everything, because they assumed people already knew about the general framework. But to us, receiving and to the Icelanders in the Middle Ages, probably, to let's say post-Viking society or societies, it's definitely a challenge to figure out what was being told here. Which brings us to the next point, the separation from the Viking Age. So you have certain cultural, ideological, and geographical barriers, making the interpretation very, very difficult, and the prevailing question about the relevance of the post-Viking sources for the people of the Viking Age, and what they actually believed in. Okay, the issue of selectivity is also related to this, and by that I mean, were these stories told only for the upper class? Because we can see, for example, Odin is a god who is prevalent in these mythological stories, and he is very much associated with the idea of the upper class. And why these stories? What happened to the other ones? Because we can definitely assume that much more material was circulating, but we only have this material at our disposition. And because of that, a source like the Poetic Edda will not be able to capture the diversity of the mental landscape, and particularly of the actual practice of these people. So you basically, as a general idea and a conclusion, by means of these written sources, you basically took something living and organic, such as Norse belief and myth, and turned it into something resembling some kind of Bible or some kind of scripture, which was not. So the Poetic Edda, neither the Poetic Edda nor the Prose Edda can be considered a scripture of the Norse. It's not. Pre-Christian religions were not really dogmatic. They had a lot of diversity, and part of the post-conversion approach to these heathen beliefs was attempting to turn them into this unified system. It probably also had a practical sense. By this I mean that if you have a unified body of heathen beliefs, it would have been more easily for a Christian mind author and so on and so forth to find arguments against it if you had something unified. So these would be the basic problems. But beyond the so-called pagan scriptures, the Poetic Edda, we do have some kinds of some clues that point out into the direction of, like I said, diversity, mythological and religious diversity beyond this text. So, for example, in the texts themselves, you have a lot of figures who are not gods, who might have been a lot more important to the ordinary people than gods themselves. You have, for example, some servants of the gods, such as the ravens Hugin and Munin of Odin, mind and memory. You have Gulinborsti, that was the boar of Freyr. You have Thor's goats. You have the Valkyriur, who were the choosers of the slain, and so on and so forth. Then you have beings with cosmological purpose. You have the Nornir, the entities dealing with destiny, and you also have the giants, who may have also had something to do with a cultic role, which is a little bit unclear to us now. You also have all kinds of beings who in Icelandic folklore are included in the so-called Huldufolk, the hidden people, who are Olvar, for example, the elves, or the Vergar. You also have a lot of other examples, such as Disir, some kind of female deities, also retrievable from old Scaldic poetry, such as Atlamol. And the spirits of the lands, the Landvættir, for example, the magical spirits, Gandir, or creatures associated with the nightmare, the Mara, and so on and so forth. The soul itself, if you read if you read either the poetic sources or the later sources, you're going to see that there isn't really any unified concept of the soul in the sense of a comparable concept with the Christian soul, because you can actually divide the Norse soul into multiple parts. You have reference to the guardian, some kind of protective entity, which is usually a female following you, the Fylgja. Possibly a dead ancestress. You have the idea of personified luck, which can also be inherited, the Hamingja. You also have the idea of shape and also shape shifting. So the idea that you're actually covered in a shell that can change according to context, the so-called hammer. You also have something which resembles our, let's say, modern idea of mind, but not quite, the hugger. And you can also have examples of figures populating the afterlife, such as the revenants known as Draugur and Afturganger. So you can see it really was a very complicated world. This is what I'm trying to tell you here. It would have been a much complicated world than we are able to retrieve from the sources we have at our disposition right now. And it is important to notice the fact that this relationship with the supernatural actually exceeds this relationship with the gods and the worship of the gods. So, yeah, as a general conclusion, Viking paganism was never something consistent. It was very regional and dependent on temporal change, dependent on peripheral influences. Think about the fact that the Vikings also had contact with other religions outside of the Christian world and outside of shamanic beliefs. They probably had contact with Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism as well. We don't know. how much further the influences wait. But at any rate, what I'm trying to tell you is that the sources are indispensable. The Poetic Edda is indispensable in order to have an idea about the Viking mind, but you cannot use only the Poetic Edda in order to talk about Norse mythology and to talk about Norse religion. And neither can I, as a matter of fact, which is why I'm going to end this presentation with the last slide. Yes. So this is something I would like to develop in my next masterclass, and this is the level of cultic and ritualistic approach, because both the written sources and the archaeological sources suggest two things. First of all, that there might have been some cultic there would have been some cultic structures, and secondly, there was definitely an individual level of belief, which unfortunately in written sources in particular is very hard to retrieve. So we have the prominent members of society, the elite levels, for whom the gods would have been the intermediaries. They would have helped them in legitimizing themselves. For example, in the Yngliga saga, we have this idea of the sacral kingship. Snorri is trying to make a big deal out of the Yngling, the legendary Yngling dynasty of Sweden, and link it to the god Freyr, for example. But in everyday life, things would have been very, very different. In the sense that this invisible population I tried to briefly present to you would have been much more relevant for somebody from the lower strata of society than for a king. And of course, you can also think about the pragmatic relationship, like Christians nowadays praying to a certain saint to help them, and so on and so forth. It would have also been a pragmatic relationship for the Norse as well. And next time I'm going to talk to you about the cultic sites, for example, the small enclosures known as Hörger, and also the larger enclosures, the Great Hall complexes known as Hof, with a lot of buried offerings, by the way. We also have a lot of evidence pointing into the direction of blood sacrifices, for example, and into the direction of some kind of temple, although I'm not sure temple is the right word to use here. But at any rate, I'm going to talk about the Upakro complex, for example. It is a very important, let's say, religious center close to Lund. In Sweden, and it is a very impressive building. It's a tall building, almost like a tower, and it has all kinds of elements suggesting that a lot of important things were going on. We have, for example, oath rings and gold foils. Speaking of the gold foils, I talked to you about at the very beginning of this lecture. And we have jewelry, weapon offerings, deposited with humans' remains. So it was definitely something very important going on. Right. The general term used to describe this is blot. Yeah. So next time I'm going to talk about that, the ritual act of killing, functioning as a gift for the gods or for the world of the invisible spirits in general, in order to form a connection to that. All right. So everything presented so far and everything I've been working on, and you can follow me on my YouTube channel as well, because I used to develop these themes over there, and hopefully I'm also going to start to write again for the World History Encyclopedia for professional and private reasons. I wasn't able to do that in the past year. So everything I showed you so far suggests a semi-structured spirituality, and the term Norse religion, although I also tend to use it, and quite a lot, it's it's somehow misleading, actually very misleading. But yeah, for the sake of simplification and lack of a better term, I think we can keep it. The question remains about the modus operandi, like I said. So what people used to do in a practical manner in order to bridge these two worlds, the world of men and the world of not only the gods, but generally speaking, the world of the supernatural. Because I repeat, I don't think the question, did the Vikings or the Norse, Scandinavians at any rate, believed in their own gods and religion, is very relevant. They would have operated in a very different world compared to our world, in the sense that the religious and non-religious were not really separated as they are for us today. So think about the fact that yeah, for a Christian today, okay, I'm going on this Sunday to church, and then I'm saying a prayer maybe, and then yeah, I'm going to mind my own business. It wasn't like that for the Norse, and it wasn't like that for many heathen people either, in the sense that these two worlds, the supernatural world and the real world, didn't really have clear borders. So thank you very much for listening and for your patience. Wow, almost 2 hours. Yeah, I am very glad I was able to pull it off.
Hello, yes, and thank you, everyone. Looks like we did have a couple questions come in the chat. I think we've got a few minutes left. Don't mind answering them. Let's see. So Polish 200 has a two-parter for us on YouTube. How much do you think the Old Norse religion influenced daily lives, followed up with, and in what way? Rites, habit, practices, etc.
Yeah, well, I think I talked a little bit about that before. It was a very different concept than the one we have nowadays about myth and religion, let's say religion, generally speaking. So people were very much linked to everything related to the supernatural world. I don't think they were able to function without it, because, for example, if I think about a poem, I think it was Atlamol, if I'm not mistaken. There is an example there about a skald, and he witnesses an alpha blood. So this is not a sacrifice for the gods, it is a sacrifice for the creatures known as elves, whatever the elves were. For the Norse, like I said, the elves as we think about them nowadays are a little bit different than the elves from the Viking Age. But anyway, he witnesses this, and he attempts to enter this building, which he thinks it is just a hall, but it is actually a cultic building, and something very important is going on there. And then he meets someone who is very angry, and he tells him to leave the place because there was a sacrifice taking place there. So and this was post-Christianization. So I think this shows us, such an example shows us very clear that both in pre-Christian Scandinavia and to some extent post-Christian Scandinavia, the relationship between people and the supernatural was one of interdependency. So they couldn't really function without having this dimension added to the, let's say, real life.
Okay, and little compliment here. Anakin, no, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative and interesting. Thank you for the feedback. And let's see, another YouTube, Color Witch 2. Thank you very much. Very enlightening that our idea of searching for a system, like in one of the three religions of the book, does not do justice to the Viking belief systems. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, when I started studying this topic, yeah, the first time I read the Poetic Edda, I was also full of stereotypes myself. I mean, I read these poems and I was like, oh my God, finally we have something comparable with the Bible of the Vikings. And then when I started studying the other material as well, I realized that this is nothing like anything related to a monotheistic religion and anything of the sort. It has to do with this obsession of ours, which stems from I think the 18th, 19th century worldview that everything has to fit somewhere. That's why we also have this obsession with finding a terminology and a classification method for the gods, like Thor, the god of thunder, and Odin, the god of wisdom, and so on and so forth. It was not that easy. These figures had a level of complexity which is very hard for us to grasp, but we like to set them straight and set them apart from one another, and I don't think that was the case here.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right. I think we have time for one last question. Dilly G, also on YouTube, asks, which movie or TV show, in your opinion, is the most accurate when it comes to Norse mythology, rituals, and customs?
Yeah, I actually held a presentation about the Northmen at a conference a couple of months ago. You can find the whole presentation on YouTube, in fact, because I posted it myself. And a part of presentation dealt with this particular topic. Although I'm not a big fan of movies dealing with Vikings, generally speaking, it's not really my thing. I think the Northman does a pretty good job in representing um, this mental universe of the Viking Age, because it somehow tries to mimic an Icelandic saga, but again with its limitation. We have at least two levels of reception here, because Icelandic sagas in themselves are an example of reception history, and then you have these movies in the contemporary times attempting to do the same thing. But the Northman, I think, did a good job, because it pointed out not only things such as the shamanistic cult of the Berserkir, for example. It also pointed out the fact that this universe was very different than our own. So I would recommend you just watch that video, because you will definitely going to find out much more than I can tell you right now. But yeah, the answer would be the Northman, for that matter.
Darn mute button again. Okay, perfect. So just to wrap up a bit, thank you very much for the presentation today. I know we've already got a part 2 set up that I'm very excited for. That will be just announced now. It's not even up on our website yet. Saturday, September 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Irina is also presenting, as far as I know, during our virtual conference. You'll be doing a section on War and Weaving, the Mythical Viking Loom. And that's Saturday, July 23rd, during our science and technology session between 10 and 11:30 a.m. I think I'm moderating that as well, so I'll see you there. Definitely check out our virtual conference, July 23rd, 24th. It's free, open access. We're going to have a ton of great presenters. Check out Irina's work. Is there anything else you'd like to plug before we go for today?
Just follow me on YouTube, TikTok, and I guess Facebook too. Yeah. Because I will be trying to post more on these channels in the upcoming weeks. Hope to have time for that as well, because I'm actually traveling to Iceland finally.
Oh, good. Exciting.
So I'm just, it's like an immersive experience for me, what's about to happen in the coming weeks. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yep.
Okay. And I'm excited about next week as well, due to the conference. Definitely interesting and something to look forward to.
For sure. Oh, and one last question came in. Color, which two are the presentations coming to YouTube? Yes, all of our presentations will be saved and archived on YouTube and Facebook, as well as Twitch, so you can watch them all there if you can't make the live stream, always. All right. And thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we will be signing off.
Thanks a lot.